just want to respond to an article that I read in The Australian, courtesy of The Times. It was entitled, "Thinking is Warped on Cannabis Legalisation." It's written by Melanie Phillips, a British journalist, author and public commenter. 4 men had to be rescued last weekend from England's highest mountain, Scafell Pike, after becoming incapable of walking due to cannabis use, said Cumbria Police. Words fail us. Oh, who hasn't been there? The article continues. Does everyone agree that these men placed an irresponsible burden on a public service? Apparently so. Does everyone agree that the use of cannabis should be discouraged to reduce its irresponsible burden on society? Well, no, quite the opposite. Now, you see this kind of argument made quite a lot by public health advocates. It makes a few assumptions that are incorrect, such as the state owning your body. I'm not going to go into it today. Last week, Prince William raised the massive issue of drug legalisation. Although he expressed no opinion, merely to raise it was inescapably to express one, since the only people for whom it is a massive issue are those who promote it. Well, you could say that about pretty much any issue that has activists behind it. At the Labor Party conference yesterday, the comedian Russell Brand called for drugs to be decriminalised. At next week's Conservative conference, the free market Adam Smith Institute will be pushing for the legalisation of cannabis. Legalisation means more users. That means more harm, not just to individuals but to society. The Institute, however, describes cannabis as a low-harm consumer product that most users enjoy without major problems. What? A huge amount of evidence shows that far from cannabis being less harmful than other illicit drugs, as befits its Class B classification, its effects are far more devastating. Long-term potheads display on average an 8-point decline in IQ over time, an elevated risk of psychosis and permanent brain damage. Cannabis is associated with a host of biological ill effects, including cirrhosis of the liver, strokes, and heart attacks. People who use it are far more likely than non-users to access other illegal drugs, and so on. Let's just address a few points here. She says that legalization means more users, that means more harm. But that's the same as saying that more cars on the road means more accidents. Doesn't really mean all that much. I mean, do the benefits outweigh the costs? Like, how much is it costing keeping marijuana off the streets and enforcing it as an illegal substance? What about the crime associated with the black market and the violence that comes with that? You can't just say more users equals more harm and have that be your argument. You've got to weigh the costs against the benefits. She also highlights the point, she says long-term potheads display an average IQ point decline and that there's an elevated risk of psychosis. Thing is, she doesn't actually cite any studies or any evidence of this. Now, there was a study done by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States in 2012 that found that persistent cannabis users show neuropsychological decline from childhood to midlife. However, a year later, the same organisation, the PNAS, did a study that found the opposite. It found that correlations between cannabis use and IQ change in the Dunedin cohort are consistent with the confounding from socioeconomic status. Now, in English, what that means is that rather than cannabis use, it was actually more to do with their socioeconomic status and whether they were poor. It found that the causal effects estimated from the previous study are likely to be overestimates and that the true effect could actually be 0. As for psychosis, the evidence does suggest that marijuana can cause psychotic reactions, but these are often short-term and wear off once the marijuana use stops. Studies also show that rather than causing schizophrenia, it actually seems a lot more likely that people who already have schizophrenia or are susceptible to it tend to be more likely to smoke marijuana. As for the other ill effects that she talks about, I'm not really going to go into it. I can't be bothered. There are health effects associated with doing pretty much anything, and she even uses the gateway drug argument, which is just silly. I mean, I would imagine that most people who use illegal drugs also started on milk. It doesn't really say much. People who want to use drugs are going to use them whether they're illegal or not, and that's a fact. And the article continues. Say the autonomy-loving free marketers, but it doesn't harm anyone other than the user. Well, that's not true either. It can destroy relationships with family, friends, and employers, which actually harms the user. Users often display more antisocial behaviour, such as stealing money or lying to get a job, as well as greater association with aggression, paranoia, and violent death. According to Stuart Rees, an Australian professor of medicine, cannabis use in pregnancy has also been linked to an epidemic of gastro something or other, in which babies are born with intestines outside their abdomen, in at least 15 nations, including the UK. Okay, here she just gets a bit silly. She says, oh, well, it doesn't harm anyone other than user, but then goes on to point out how it only really harms the user. I mean, it harms their relationships and their job prospects. So that's just harming the user, really. And she even talks about how it harms babies when pregnant. Well, so does drugs and alcohol. Like, all drugs and alcohol do that. Here's a tip to any ladies out there who are pregnant or thinking of getting pregnant. Don't smoke, don't do drugs, don't do anything other than what is optimally healthy when you are pregnant with a baby. I mean, I would have thought that would be obvious. Anyway, the legalizers' argument is that keeping cannabis illegal does not control the harm it does. Yet, wherever its supply has been liberalised, its use and therefore the harm it does have both gone up. In 2001, Portugal decriminalised illegal drugs, including cocaine, heroin, and cannabis. Sparked by a report by the American Free Market Cato Institute, which claimed this policy was a resounding success, Portugal has been cited by legalisers elsewhere as proof that liberalising drug laws is the magic bullet to erase the harm done by illegal drugs. The truth is very different. In 2010, Manuel Pinto Coelho of the Association for a Drug-Free Portugal wrote in the BMJ, "Drug decriminalisation in Portugal is a failure. There is a complete and absurd campaign of manipulation of facts and figures of Portuguese drug policy." Here again, she just makes the assumption that more use equals somehow more damage to society without weighing the costs and the benefits against it. For the same reason that saying more cars means more car accidents. Yeah, but what about the economic productivity as a result of having more cars? You got to weigh all the costs against all the benefits. Yeah, using more drugs, if more people using drugs means there's going to be more individual effects on those individual people. But what about the cost savings associated with not having to police the crime anymore, with not having to actually spend money on catching small-time criminals? And if it is legalised, then that means that there's no longer a black market for those products, which means violent drug gangs don't go in and dominate the market. There are plenty of benefits to legalisation, and simply pointing out individual health effects doesn't actually change those benefits. The benefits that you do see are across society, whereas all the risks are associated with individuals and their own choice. She then points out a couple of studies that just cite an increase in use of drugs, something that doesn't really say much. I mean, even if drug use is actually up, that doesn't mean that society is being harmed overall, or that more people are being harmed by those drugs. It could be that those extra people using those drugs are actually responsible adults who are using them responsibly. The European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction shows a pretty clear decrease in the number of clients receiving treatment for drug addiction. And whilst the number of people reporting that they've done drugs over their life has increased, the number of people who report doing drugs over the last year or over the last month has decreased substantially. And the biggest benefit overall in Portugal is that the number of drug-induced deaths has dropped substantially ever since decriminalisation. We then get to the cusp of the argument. For free marketeers, this evidence of devastating harm to individuals and society is irrelevant. Nothing can be allowed to dent their dogmatic belief that all human life is a transaction. Market forces are a religion and the rights of consumers are sacrosanct. Says the Adam Smith Institute about cannabis legalisation. The object isn't harm elimination, it's not even harm reduction alone, it's utility maximisation. In other words, they want as many people as possible to be puffing on those spliffs. This one was actually pretty funny, because she obviously doesn't understand what the term utility means when it comes to economics. It's not just about getting people smoking as many spliffs, it's about not actually spending so much money enforcing drug policies, which is a big reason to legalise drugs in the first place. Had she actually gone to Adam Smith Institute's website, she would have seen this article, which is 8 reasons to legalise cannabis. So we can go down here. So fundamentally, because it's enjoyable was point number 1. Number of people who use it each year. The law isn't predictably consistent or enforced. So there. You can see more here. So prohibition increases the supply of stronger and potentially more harmful types of cannabis. More revenues from drug supply goes to criminal gangs, creating financing for other more harmful activities like violent side effects such as turf wars. Legalization could produce benefits to the government in terms of tax. The public isn't as opposed as you think, etc., etc. So when it comes to utility, it's not just getting people consuming more of the drug getting as many people consuming the drug as possible. It's about the utility across society and the full benefits across society. The rest of the article is a little bit dull. She just goes on to attack people who support legalization and uses that word free marketeers again. She obviously doesn't like the free market. She misrepresents Adam Smith's argument in his theory of moral sentiments. From Adam Smith's website, they actually say, freedom and nature, Smith concludes, are a surer guide to the creation of a harmonious functioning society than the supposed reason of philosophers and visionaries. So he actually argued the opposite of what she's claiming. This article is nothing more than your usual prohibition-style arguments. It ignores the facts and just pushes things like, more people are going to use it if it's legalized, therefore if more people use it, there's more harm across society, which is something that just isn't true, because prohibition, as we know, creates a lot of problems. Things like black markets, gangsters, violence, and all that kind of thing. Dangerous alternatives is another thing that black markets create. So prohibition doesn't work. We know this. Prohibition does not work, and it's about time that we started thinking of better alternatives. Decriminalisation is a start, but what I think we should be aiming for is the total legalisation and regulation. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more. See you next time.